Hello. So the basic question that I'm asking here and would like to answer today is why does Eastern State Penitentiary resemble a medieval castle? And before I answer this question, it's important to ask why I'm looking at Eastern State Penitentiary. And the reason I'm looking at this prison in particular is that it was one of the first major prisons in the US. It was one of the first in the world to really try to establish the prison as a new type of architecture that had only recently emerged in the history of architecture as a type of building you would build. And it was also a prison that inspired hundreds of other prisons around the world. And so that makes this prison a good place to look at the history of prisons because it is one of the first and one of the original. And the specific question that I'm looking at here is this tension I see in the prison design, a tension between the way the prison looks like on the outside and the way this structure looks like on the inside. Inside, it is this rational division of space that we see on the screen here in this original image of the prison drawn by one of the prisoners. It is a rational space with a central guard tower and radiating wings and individual cells. And then this internal appearance contrasts with the external appearance that is not modern like the interior, but is rather backward looking. It is an exterior that resembles a medieval castle that looks back toward the kinds of pre-modern prisons that Eastern State was trying to replace, was trying to improve upon. And so it is this tension that I ask between the way the prison looks like on the outside and the way it operates more modern on the inside. And in terms of the history of prisons, Robin Evans, the leading historian on this topic, writes that it was the idea of the prison, not the fact of the prison, that was to engage the architect's imagination. And the idea of the prison was built up from historical associations, specifically in this case, medieval associations, and medieval associations of the castle. Here we have two images. On one side we have a certificate given to a member of the Philadelphia Society for Alleviating the Miseries of Public Prisons, which was the organization tasked with helping to construct and oversee Eastern State Penitentiary. And so this certificate, I think, really highlights or points to the way that this prison is a civic institution, and the way that this prison is something that is a source of pride, a kind of institution that you would want to be a member of. And indeed, all of the leading committee members of the individual who supervised the construction and running of the prison were the city's leading industrialists. And then the other image we have here is of the prison's location in the city of Philadelphia, right there in the city's northwest corner. And it was positioned on a hilltop, which really made this prison a visible structure, a public structure, that could communicate through its appearance certain, perhaps, values about prison or the certain pride that its builders had in its construction and design. In this animation, I walk you through where the prison was located in this corner of the city. It consisted of a central guard tower from which 7 wings radiated. And the front of this prison was that medieval castle we just saw. The walls were 30 feet high by 12 feet thick by 670 feet to a side. And here we really start to approach the central guard tower of the prison. So it is a central guard tower that is directly descended from Jeremy Bentham's Panopticon from 1789. And here we see at Eastern State Penitentiary one of the first concrete realizations of the principles of panopticism. It is that idea from the central guard tower. One guard can survey all the prisoners over all the cell blocks, as we just saw in that panoramic view. Here we take a cross-section of the cells, and we get to look down one of the double-height cell blocks. Here we have the central corridor, we have double-stacked tiers of cells, and we have individual exercise yards for all the prisoners. And as we descend right down the corridor, we can see this cathedral-like interior that would have been presented to visitors to this prison. In terms of the division of space, we have the internal corridors in green, we have the individual exercise yards in orange, and we have the cells in red. And so it is a prison that practices total solitary confinement. And we can read the layout of this prison as almost being analogous to an internal or self-enclosed kind of city. And it is this prison wall, this external appearance, that mediates the interior and exterior, that separates these two cities, of the small micro-city within the prison walls from the larger city outside. Here we have this image. I just pulled it up because I thought it was illustrative of Eastern State Penitentiary. We have the various civic institutions of 19th century Philadelphia. We have the courthouse, the mint, the Royal Exchange, the hospital, the college. And what interests me about the prison is that among the variety of other institutions in the city, it was the only structure that was built to resemble a castle. And so this leads me to feel that this prison is a member of a variety of other civic institutions in Philadelphia, but was somehow separated from them, the only one among them that looked back toward a perhaps romanticized or even fearsome medieval past, in contrast to all the other neoclassical and almost Renaissance-type structures in the city. And it is this fear of the Middle Ages that really spoke to the prison designer's initial intentions. So in the project brief sent to the architect, that is to John Haviland, the patrons required that the exterior of a solitary prison, this prison, should exhibit as much as possible great strength and convey to the mind a cheerless blank indicative of the misery which awaits the unhappy being who enters within its walls. And this is from their commissioner's minutes. And this was the specific project sent to Haviland, and in response, Haviland chose the image of the medieval castle as something that would fulfill the objectives of having a prison exterior that communicates certain values of fear, of terror, and of kind of a warning. Here we have that view down the central cathedral-like corridor of the prison. And this was the space that would have been presented to visitors who saw this prison, and you could kind of see this prison as a 19th century rereading or a rationalization or a reinterpretation of the medieval cathedral interior. So it is a castle, something from a feudal history, and it is a cathedral, something from a religious history, and it is the individual cells, perhaps related to monastic history of the monastic cell, and it is these medieval elements that are taken and synthesized, except synthesized in a secularized and non-religious context. And here we have this image from the frontispiece of Ivanhoe, a 19th century very popular literature about the Middle Ages, from the Philadelphia Library, published 1819. We have that image of Haviland, and I think that, in the background of both of these images, we have this reflection on the Middle Ages, this awareness of the Middle Ages that 19th century people develop from literature, from their own visits to medieval castles. John Haviland was from England and was exposed to castles at a young age. And it is this association of the medieval with literature, with Romanticism, that I think really feeds into the use of castle imagery, not just at Eastern State, but at the hundreds of other prisons that are descended or inspired from Eastern State Penitentiary. And here are a few of these prisons inspired by Eastern State. And all of these prisons here express this kind of internal and external tension. It is this exterior facade that, unlike a castle that keeps people out, it is a kind of a modern castle that keeps people in. It is, however, a modern castle that keeps people in, and that is an inversion of the past, and also a facade for the past, because it is these elements, these decorative elements of the portcullis, of the crenellations, of the medieval windows that are only facade deep, that do not reflect anything beyond the frontispiece that is presented to the public. And even in places as far away as Japan in the 19th century, some 19th century Japanese prisons again resemble European castles. And it is this borrowing of the Middle Ages that, in a certain sense, I think in the 19th century becomes dissociated from that genuine medieval past and is used in places as far away as Japan, where there was no genuine European version or feudal version in the European aesthetic sense of the Middle Ages. There are tendencies at Eastern State that are reflected in the broader history of 19th century architecture. We have in the 19th century this strange or perhaps uncomfortable tendency to put different kinds of historicizing or historical structures on what are otherwise modern structures. So a few examples are the Temple Mill Flaxworks in Leeds, a factory for producing textiles and linens and garments that resembled an Egyptian tomb, the Temple of Dendur, Egyptian temple on the outside. We have things like the gasworks in Tegel, Berlin, which tried to resemble a medieval castle, something that had nothing to do with the manufacturing and distribution of gas, a very modern source of energy. And then we have things like St. Pancras Station, a train station that on the exterior resembles a medieval church or a medieval guildhall from Central Europe. And it is this contrast between the modern interior of these structures and their historicizing exterior that I feel that we can examine through Eastern State Penitentiary. And it is Eastern State Penitentiary that is only one of many other 19th century structures that have this same kind of tension of an exterior whose form does not fully express or expresses something different from the interior. Alexis de Tocqueville, a 19th century French author who visited America in 1833, wrote that Eastern State Penitentiary, this penitentiary, was the only edifice in this country which is calculated to convey to our citizens the external appearance of those magnificent and picturesque castles of the Middle Ages, which contribute so eminently to embellish the scenery of Europe. However, no one looking at this Eastern State Penitentiary would have thought it to be a medieval castle. Everyone passing it would have been aware that this is, in fact, a modern structure. And so it is this medieval reading of the medieval castle that fools no one, that induces fear or induces these associations with the past that are quite obviously contrived or imagined. In an additional sense, in a literary sense, Eastern State Penitentiary fits into the Gothic Revival movement. You have people like Ruskin and the English architect Pugin, who writes a book called Contrast in 1841, which was one of the books pivotal in establishing the Gothic Revival movement in Europe. And in Pugin's Contrast, he contrasts the appearance of the medieval city in 1440 in the lower left-hand corner image with that of the modern city. And he reads this medieval past as an idealized past, a past with prettier churches, a past focused around morals and Christianity and values. And he reads the modern present as overly industrialized, as an uncomfortable kind of modernism. And similarly, on that image on the right-hand side, we see the two contrasted residences for the poor. We have Pugin's representation of the modern prison as a radial prison with a central guard tower, and in the case of this image, we have 8 radiating wings from that tower. And it is this, he represents the modern prison as Eastern State Penitentiary, or something very much like Eastern State Penitentiary. And those images around show people in chains, in torture, people whose bodies are being dissected, in this image right here. And then he contrasts this prison with the medieval monastery, which he reads as being an idealized form, a Christian form of the past, where the poor people are taken good care of, where there is a certain degree of equality and fairness and justice and all these other idealized values that descend from religious thought. At Eastern State, we see, I feel, a structure that synthesizes these two visions of modernity. It is that internal reading of the rational structure that is modern, that is organized, where there is solitary confinement and isolation and alienation, too, from society for the people who are imprisoned there. And then we see this exterior appearance that speaks to, that looks back to, an idealized and romanticized medieval past that would have been perhaps more comfortable to the 19th century wealthy Philadelphia public to have such a visible structure that resembled a comfortable past as opposed to a perhaps more uncomfortable modernity that was not nearly as pleasing as the Gothic. And this all leads me to my conclusion, where I feel that we can conceptualize Eastern State Penitentiary and 19th century prisons in general as more than just prisons. We should also conceptualize prisons as being sources of wealth, that is, for the people who operate them, of the industrialists who supervised Eastern State Penitentiary in its early days. All of them, most of them, were industrialists, were large manufacturers, traders, people who were not of religious origins. We can also see the prison as part of democracy. If you'll remember that earlier image that showed Eastern State Penitentiary as one of a variety of other 19th century institutions, like the university, like the Senate House, like the Exchange. All of these are governing institutions, and Eastern State Penitentiary was one of them. It is perhaps ironic or necessary that in order for democracy to function, in order for justice to function, the government needs to be able to carry through on its promise that criminals will be punished, and perhaps the image of the castle, that foreboding image of the castle, could communicate that message of punishment and also communicate the prison as being part of, yet also separated from, the other types of institutions in government. We can also see the prison as part of a 19th century aesthetic movement that fits into the broader story of factories, of castles, of gasworks, of train stations, all of which believed in or exhibited ornament and borrowing from their exterior. So it is this borrowing from history, this borrowing from the past, that is reappropriated, transformed, reused in the 19th century in ways that are oftentimes unexpected, as we see at Eastern State. And all three of these interpretations, the prison as source of wealth, the prison as part of democracy, and the prison as part of a 19th century aesthetic movement, these all fit into the broader category, or the broader reading of the prison as a symbol. And so on that note, I end that presentation, and I thank you for listening.